An Archivist Tale is sponsored by From the Page.
Online engagement can be deeper than a like button. From the Page lets you collaborate with your community to increase the accessibility of archival materials while providing a rich, immersive experience. Visit FromThePage.com/AT to learn more. And if you're considering crowdsourcing but don't have an IT team to develop software in-house, From the Page makes it easy to get started and straightforward to reuse the transcriptions to make your digital assets more discoverable.
Visit FromThePage.com/AT to find a time to brainstorm with Ben and Sara, From the Page's founders, about your project ideas. And now to the show.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Trivett, and I'm an archivist, and this is another episode of An Archivist's Tale, a podcast created by my husband, Jeff Huth, and me. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Karen. We are still in Austin.
Yes, we are.
It's a little warm, but it's not too bad.
Not too bad. It's early, though.
It may get warmer.
We are in town for the Society of American Archivists annual meeting.
Right, which for us pretty much starts today because we have meetings today.
Yes, we do. And speaking of today, it is Friday, August 2nd, 2019, and the time is 9:24 Central Time.
Oh, that's true.
Yep.
Welcome to Austin, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, we are excited today, as we always are, to greet our guests. And it's a special occasion because it's another part of our 2x2 series where we interview a couple, be they business partners or life partners.
Or both.
Or both, as is the case today. And we are delighted to have you with us. If you'll introduce yourselves, please.
My name is Sara Brumfield. I'm a software engineer and a small business owner.
My name is Ben Brumfield. I'm a software engineer and part of a small business owner.
Interesting.
Welcome to the broadcast.
Broadcast.
Well, podcast.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good, very good. So I'm just going to dive right in with our first question, and that is, tell us your archivist support origin story.
Sure. So my archivist support origin story really starts off as a family paper story. Really, my introduction to this world was through a set of historic documents that were a set of diaries kept by my great-great-grandmother. On her death, the diaries were distributed to all of her grandchildren, and I see Karen wincing here. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So the collection was completely dispersed, and my family inherited 2 diaries. And in 1992, my father transcribed one of those diaries on WordPerfect 5.1 or something like that, and printed them out and had them copied at Kinko's. And for years after that, he sent them off to relatives in that small part of rural Virginia that he was from. They became a kind of samizdat hit. We would go to that area, and people we didn't know would come up and talk about how their nephew had made a photocopy of that diary.
Wow.
And you'd have 80-year-old women coming up and saying, whenever I get up and I have a bad day, I go and I read one of the diary entries in which here's this 80-year-old woman who's getting up and she's feeding the chickens and she's cooking dinner and she's making a quilt and all these kinds of things. And that just kind of keeps me going. And the power of these primary sources to kind of bring meaning to the public, right? These, and particularly, elderly, rural public members was really inspiring. I said, wow, this is fantastic. I need to do the same thing. So I tried to transcribe the other diary.
Oh, yeah.
Several years later, and I discovered that I couldn't do it alone. I don't know that much about tobacco agriculture. I don't know the people and the places who were involved in the project. Years had passed, and I'm a different generation, so a lot of the terminology I didn't really get. Around this time, Wikipedia was getting started, and I really love the wiki model of collaboration, where you have volunteers who can work on the same kinds of documents at the same time, but on their own time, without somebody saying, well, you're doing this piece by then, here I'm assigning this chapter to you or you. And so I decided that was what I needed for my own family papers project. And so I built the tool that we eventually
because
labeled
we're
From the
software
Page.
engineers,
Yes, that's right.
Tool.
Yes, and frankly, it was a lot easier to write software than it was to transcribe documents. Right? These are hard things, right?
Yes.
So I released that as open source. Other people started using it, but other people in my family started using that as well. And so we started seeing people who I didn't know work on transcribing the diaries. And they would work on a few entries a day, and they would call up their elderly relatives that were involved, and the word got out, and the collection started coming together. I would get packets in the mail that would have a diary in them with just a note saying, "It looks like you'll do more with this than I will."
Oh, wow.
So, so that was really how we got started. And once we released the tool open source, it was used by libraries, archives, and museums, and historians and documentary editors to work on their own collections.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Ben went to the very first that camp, the Humanities and Technology Unconference, and I think that was a big piece of like starting to transition from this personal project to something that could be more generally useful by people. And in fact, we hosted the very first regional VAT camp. Was associated with SAA in 2009 here in Austin. 10 years ago.
And so we and one instructional technologist at the University of Texas and 2 archivists who were going to be in town put the first regional VAT camp unconference together. And of course, that was primarily for archivists. And so that's our introduction to the archives world.
That's just incredible. I'm curious to make sure that listeners know exactly what your enterprise is.
Right.
What is the software
who
we're
are
talking
we?
about?
Started with that. So our software is called FromThePage. It's a collaborative or a crowdsourcing transcription platform. It's released open source, so it's installed generally at universities that have larger IT staffs install it for pedagogy and research purposes. And then we also run it as a software as a service, so an online service that archives, libraries, and museums pay us a fee for to then run their projects on.
And to be clear, it's not a digitization outsourcing service, right? There are many of those in which you have OCR, you have documents to be scanned. Our tool is a platform for people who already have their material digitized, often already online somewhere, and they have, in many cases, volunteers who are coming in and doing work with the institution, but they're going on vacation, or particularly for state institutions, there are a lot of people who are interested in working with the state archives who don't live in the capital, and this is a way for them, for the archivists, to reach out to those volunteers and those interested members of the public and engage them working on transcribing documents that have already been digitized.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it's no secret to our listeners that you are a very generous sponsor of an Archivist Tale.
Yes, yeah.
So thank you for
the idea
that support.
of being in people's ears, right? Neat model.
Well, Sarah, tell us a little bit about your background, how you migrated to this place.
So I'm a software engineer. I worked for IBM and a number of startups for over 20 years. And I was always around when we were working on From the Page and doing some things with it, but not really doing most of the work. And then we got to a point where we decided to really invest. We actually hired another developer to help us make it look great, because we're not very good at the looking great side of software development. We're good at the writing good code, but not the making it look pretty.
Okay.
And we started, thinking about how we could move this to the center of our lives, because it's a lot more fun than working for a corporation, which we were both doing, right? And so, trying to think so I love business, small business. I grew up in a family business. My parents bought and sold heavy equipment and construction equipment. And that's a model that really appeals to me. We have 2 daughters. I like having business discussions with them and making, the act of earning a living is kind of real when you're running your own business, right? So that speaks to me in a real values-based way. So let's see. Ben quit his day job 2012, and I quit mine about 4 years ago, so 2015, to do From the Page and then kind of ancillary work. We do a lot of consulting for digital humanities work as well. Right. So is that enough of an origin story? It's not really a good origin story, but it's a little bit of pieces, right? So, yeah.
We don't have any specific requirements.
No, exactly.
No radioactive spiders or something.
Nothing's going to go wrong.
Nope.
It's going to be great. So, with one of the things, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday in our last podcast, is that we might have records, but people want a kind of access that was not before possible, and they want it all the time. And so we used to think, well, it's not reasonable for you to expect us to make all of this so available. But now it's like, well, if you want to get to your customers, you have to have that digital access. And even if they just put up digital images, well, you can see them, but you can't search them. And if you cannot read older handwriting, as more and more people cannot, you actually can't access them in any useful way.
Exactly.
And so this kind of way of dealing with archives, which was totally antithetical to us, say 20 years ago, is now really central. Not everybody has agreed that it is, but it really became. Just to tell you one little story about my previous employer, I worked for the New York State Archives, and New York State Archives has large collections of Dutch colonial records. The one problem is they were mostly burned in this giant fire in 1911, but they're still around. They were transcribed to some degree ahead of time, and they've been translated. They had a project which put up an image of every side of every sheet of paper, and then gave you a transcription of it into Middle Dutch, and then gave you a translation into modern English.
Yeah. How much did that cost to put all that together?
Hugely costly. Except the one thing is, part of it was funded by the government of the Netherlands, because the Netherlands was trying to essentially stitch together their heritage of, let's say, conquest, because that's essentially what it was, which spans the Caribbean, Indonesia, New York, and other places around New York, someplace in Africa. I couldn't remember. And of course, they included themselves too in the Netherlands. And so there was this source to it for this country that's a fairly small country, but did really have a very wide reach in the world at one time. And so it sometimes matters what you want to say about yourself when you do these things. So what do the people that you work with, what are the things they're trying to do with this? How is this allowing them to fulfill their archival mission?
It varies from project to project,
very much,
really.
Yes. So we have 7 of the state archives running projects on From the Page.
Oh, wow.
And I think they're very public oriented because they're part of state governments, and because they know people are looking for their records. They're looking for family history. They're even just looking up, like, Maryland has a project to do marriage records because they're like, this is the thing that people come and look up the most, right? If we can get this online, it's a big public service.
Sure.
But we have a lot of, like, you want to tell the Meredith story? I think that's a fun public,
sure.
I can if you want. But
Meredith is a digital archivist at the Alabama Department of McDonough, right?
Yeah.
The Alabama Department of Archives and History, and they have this combination of a very frequently used collection, which was a set of World War I service cards. So there's one index card for each soldier sailor or Marine who served in World War I from the state of Alabama, and it mentions where they enlisted, race, like where they were born, things that are of interest to genealogists, but you also have unit and things like that. And they only had them cataloged essentially by county and by first letter of surname.
Wow.
So,
which is better than
nothing. Right. I mean,
you can get somewhere.
Right. You can get somewhere, presuming you know what county the person you're researching was from, right? Otherwise, you kind of have to look for all of these. And so they really wanted really item level, card level transcription and indexing so that they could index them in a more complete way.